Our next session is called Keeping a Destination, a conversation about shared wealth and the sharing economy of tourism. In this session, Megan Epler-Wood will talk to us about how travel destinations are created. She will answer questions like, who is responsible for governing certain destinations? Why do we feel as travelers it's best to experience a place before anyone else? What happens when a destination can no longer support tourism? And how do we share destinations responsibly? Megan will be talking to us about all these things and more. Megan Epler-Wood founded the International Ecotourism Society in 1990 and was its CEO through 2002. Since then, she has authored the new book, Sustainable Tourism on a Finite Planet. She's also the director of the International Sustainable Tourism Initiative at the Center for Health and the Global Environment at the T.H. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard University. She leads an international research program on tools to mitigate tourism's growing global impacts. She's also launching a new program on sustainable tourism at the Center for Sustainable Global Enterprise in the Samuel Curtis Johnson Graduate School of Management at Cornell University. She's the principal of Epler-Wood International, which has raised millions of dollars of investment for sustainably designed tourism and community development projects in over 20 countries, working with USAID, the World Bank, and Inter-American Development Bank.
Okay. Hi, Megan. I am so excited to have you here at the summit and to be learning a little bit more about sustainable travel, and you have some very specific, wonderful things to talk about today, and I'm excited to get started.
All right. Well, thank you for having me, Claire.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I'd like to start with the question of what is a destination? What makes a destination?
Well, a destination is where we travel to, and it can be a town, it can be a park, it can be the countryside. It is any place that we travel to. But there's one really important thing about destinations, and in most instances, other people live there. So when we go to a place, we're not only visiting it, but we're visiting people that live there, and they're normally living their daily lives, as we all know. And so the destination is a place that we share with people who live there, and also, of course, all kinds of wildlife when we're interested in ecotourism or cultural heritage monuments. All of these things are what are known as common resources. And so when we go and we travel to a destination, we're normally sharing that with somebody else, be it people, wildlife, or heritage.
Interesting. Very interesting. Okay. So when we get into destinations and sharing spaces with the people that live there and their environments, who governs those destinations, and is that something we need to take into account?
Yes, I think it is, and it's something that I think all travelers could benefit from thinking about. I think a lot of times we go to a place and we assume that someone is taking care of it. That's a natural assumption. If you go to a park, you assume that the parks are taking care, the park authorities are taking care of it. If you go to a town, you assume the municipal authorities are taking care of it, or say a UNESCO heritage site, and you assume they're taking care of it. But you would be really, really surprised to know that, in fact, that is not the case in general. That it is very difficult to know, even for me as an expert who's been working on this for over 25 years, to know who's in charge. And that is a big question for all of us as travelers. Who is in charge? And then why does that matter? So maybe we can discuss that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So kind of getting into the idea of, when we travel to a place, so we're always kind of assuming that it's best if we get there first. If no one else has touched it, no one else is there. It always kind of ruins an experience when you show up and there's hundreds of people there and it just doesn't feel as special. I'm wondering where that mindset kind of comes from to make us think that we should be the only ones experiencing these places, or we should be the first ones there?
Well, I think it's two different parallel phenomenon, and in my book that recently came out, I got a chance to explore that mindset, and I thought about it a lot myself, Claire, and I decided it's because humans are migratory species that we actually started, of course, in Africa and populated the planet in a relatively short period of time. Most other wildlife or animals that had populated the planet before us, or even pre-humans that are in our same genus, didn't go as far as we have. And so we now know, of course, that people came across the Bering Strait to populate the Americas. They went to even by probably boats or by land bridges to Australia. So there is something very, very deep in the Homo sapien psyche that drives us to be the first, because there's all kinds of benefits if you get there first from a survival perspective. Now, obviously, that was millennia ago, but nonetheless, I believe that psyche is still working. But the problem is, and my book's name is Sustainable Tourism on a Finite Planet, and as we know, we've got over 7 billion residents on this planet now, and there are very, very few places left anymore that actually are unexplored. Even Antarctica, which would have been maybe the ultimate unexplored continent, is regularly visited now. So I think that psyche that is natural within us is not really very well adapted to current situations.
Wow, yeah, that's really interesting to think about, and to think about how satisfying it is when you do find, a place that feels like it hasn't been touched. I mean, like you said, it most likely has been explored and discovered, but when no one's there, and it feels like, no one's been there for a while, how satisfying that feeling is. Wow.
I think it's really deep within us, and as we know, not just this particular, I would love more exploration of that theory of mine, and I'll admit it's just a theory, but it's based on a great book that I recently read called Sapiens, that looks at the history of our species, and it looks very, very well at why we have covered the planet, why we've outcompeted other species. So I do think that now we are in a position where, as you know, there's this drive to go to space.
Yeah.
Because that's like the ultimate new place to explore. We love to explore. But when it comes to our global heritage, we need to rethink because no one's in charge of this. And as a result, there's a lot of things we need to learn about how to be sure the places that we love all over the planet are protected.
Wonderful. And that brings me into my next question about global shared wealth. And so we talked about that a little bit in the beginning when we were talking about destinations. But could you describe the idea behind global shared wealth and the role that it plays in travel?
Absolutely. If you think about it, many of the places that we love to travel to are ancient monuments, say the pyramids or Angkor Wat, or they are spectacular parks. Let's just say Yosemite or the Serengeti in Africa. At these kinds of places are, of course, in countries, but in many ways they're part of this global shared wealth. They're part of strategies that have been established in my lifetime, actually in the 60s, to protect parks, to protect cultural monuments through UN strategies like UNESCO. But frankly, none of those strategies to protect what are really shared wealth were thinking about this many tourists going there. They never thought of that. In fact, I know I worked for the man who was the establisher of the UNESCO World Heritage concept, Russell Train, and he was an inspiration to me. I worked for him at World Wildlife Fund. He was, of course, many years older than me and had a vision that globally we need to establish the importance of these through the UN, which we did, But we never got to the part of how are we going to pay for the maintenance of all these places. And that is really lacking. And so as a result, so many of these places that we visit really don't have an adequate strategy for paying for the protection of these sites. So as we go, let's say the Taj Mahal, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. There's millions of people visiting that site, and apparently it's getting increasingly uncomfortable to visit it because there is no very good system, for example, to manage these crowds. So it's not only just a question of protecting these sites, but also how to manage the number of people that are visiting. So it's becoming an increasingly urgent issue. So for travelers, of course, you need to consider where you're going. Barcelona, Amsterdam are starting to say, you can't go to all these places in our city anymore. The Trevi Fountain in Rome just a week ago announced that you really can't just all go at the same time to the fountain. We're going to have to create a system where only a certain number of people can go every day. And so these types of ideas are only just starting to emerge on the landscape, but they're incredibly important for us as travelers.
Yeah, absolutely. That's amazing. You just mentioned the Trevi Fountain. I was there about a month ago. And I was actually wondering if they were going to implement some kind of system, because we went and, it's like the streets are not very crowded in that area, and then you turn a corner and boom, just this wall of people. And, just trying to maneuver through the people to get one glance at the fountain and then try to rush out of there because, you're getting squished and elbowed. And it was amazing because we were able to get up there and we took a picture. And, of course, it's this beautiful, beautiful fountain. I mean, everybody should be able to see it if they're in Rome. And then we went around and we took a picture of the crowd. And, I mean, the crowd was just this sea of people. And you wouldn't think that, judging from the first picture.
Exactly. I have this great pictures of the Taj Mahal in my presentations that I give around the world. One showing the beautiful pictures that we all see of the Taj Mahal, and then from a blog that I found showing all of the crowds. I mean, really thousands and thousands of people standing in long lines to get in, that you never see those photos. Yeah. So yes, it is something now that we all have to consider.
Absolutely. So that kind of brings me into our next question, kind of talking about how global shared wealth at these destinations could be divvied up. And so, like you said, this planet has finite resources. I mean, they can and might run out. And what are some ways that we can try to protect these places?
Yeah, I think as travelers, what we have to begin to be aware of is that somehow more financial resources are going to have to reach these places. It's not a question of anyone being really at fault. I don't like that discussion because it doesn't get at the systematic problem that we have. So often people ask me, well, which is the right company, or how do I travel responsibly? But what I'm talking about is a more systemic question, and that is, how do we begin to let these places know from a political and perspective that we want these places protected? I think that's a more strategic question than what is my personal responsibility. Because this is a question of governance around the world. And these countries where they may be collecting your tax dollars, okay, when every time that you stay in a hotel in most countries in the world, you're going to be paying an additional tax. And that can vary from a few percent up to 15% or more. You can check your bill when you look at it. And those taxes are allocated in different ways, but I believe we need to start talking about a global dialogue about what's going to happen with those taxes in future. Right now, what we know is that perhaps as much as 80% of those taxes are going to marketing tourism in the country where you are. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but we do know that marketing tourism at the governmental level is a multi-billion-dollar business. So every time that you pay to stay in a hotel in Siem Reap near Angkor Wat, they're using as much as 80% of those tax dollars to actually market more people going there. So now think about that, and think about how in future, I'm not launching this, but I can tell you I have an experience that I'll share that was very successful. When I first got into the field of ecotourism, we were looking at the cost to go to parks in Costa Rica. And they had a very, very cheap entry fee, and it was uniform for both foreigners and for locals, and it was probably $1 to enter. And we thought, let's start a campaign where the foreigners, not the locals, actually wrote the Costa Rican government and said, I'd be willing to pay more. And actually, Claire, we were a really small organization in those days when I was running that campaign. We got that policy changed in a year.
Wow.
They changed it so that foreigners paid more than locals, which is a very good policy, and many parks around the world now do that. So nothing like this has ever been tried with our tax dollars, but it's my theory that there could be a very effective campaign for travelers to tell governments that they want more of their tax dollars that they spend in country spent on the protection of the places that they're visiting.
Wonderful. So are you suggesting like travelers write letters to specific people, or what are some good ways to reach out now?
I would think that, it's very easy to look up the Ministry of Tourism in any location. They are very, very proud individuals in every country of their resources. So, of course, we have to be very respectful. But at the same time, thank them for the terrific place and how much you loved it. But at the same time, express your concern about how perhaps these places are deteriorating. Whatever you may have noticed, the excess crowds, the possible deterioration of coral reefs, which we see in many locations around the world. Any scuba diver is capable of noticing that, and even snorkelers. And writing the Ministry of Tourism, expressing your concern about how to make sure that the tax dollars that you're spending in that country are being used to protect those places.
Wonderful. I love it. Awesome. So we're kind of talking about access, talking about maybe having travelers pay a little bit more when they go to see a place, or I've even seen it at various menus. When you go to a restaurant, travelers sometimes pay a higher price for meals than locals do. I'd like to get into a little bit of a conversation about access and equal access, and how that kind of works with keeping a place sustainable.
Well, are you talking about locals versus foreigners in the same location?
A little bit of that, and then maybe also getting into the topic of limiting access. Like only having so many people a day go to the Trevi Fountain, only having so many people enter into a park, and getting like permit systems set up and that kind of a thing as well.
Okay, yeah. Well, the best example of a place that did convert that from being a very bad problem to a good experience is the Inca Trail that I'm familiar with. And when I first went there in the late 1990s, they were seeing terrible crowds, and they were also having a big problem with low-price tours being unregulated, and porters actually being overloaded with too much weight per passenger. And when I was at Machu Picchu in 1998, Claire, a porter died. Yeah, I was not with them. I was at Machu Picchu, but these porters came running down the trail to call for the ambulance because he had been carrying well over 100 pounds, is my understanding. Wow. So it wasn't because of that event, but within a few years, they regulated that. And now only a certain number of people can go on the Inca Trail every year. It's a permitted experience. And then, of course, those permits also help to maintain the trail and keep it very nice, because one of the other problems they used to have was so much waste and garbage along the trail that they used to say, follow the toilet paper.
Jeez.
Yeah. Right. So obviously that was a situation that was out of control. And so they now use those permit funds to not only limit the number of passengers, but maintain it as a good experience. And to also regulate the porter situation. So they're much more careful now. They don't allow that kind of low-price tour where they're not paying the porters a living wage. So those are big advancements.
Yes.
And I think it's a great example. And after that, many years later, I went to the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, a common pool resource if there ever was one of the most important heritage monuments in the world. I happened to be there after the Arab Spring, so it was empty. But I asked my guides, what are they doing to control crowds here? Because they have the most amazing art that you see underground that was really not very well protected from what I could see. You could touch this. You could go right next to it, and with crowds you would never be able to control people touching it. Well, they said nothing, that their overall approach in Egypt was to just make sure they got as many passengers as they could into these areas by cramming as many people as they could through the underground passageways. So I think Egypt is still in a very low volume situation. I don't believe that their tourism has recovered, so it's not an emergency right now there. But nonetheless, it's an opportunity, isn't it, for them now, while they are experiencing lower crowds, to put in some better policies to manage the number of people that are going in, maybe raise some prices for foreigners, and make sure that they get a lower volume and higher quality experience. So that's a couple of examples.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you very much for that explanation. So what does it mean if the most popular sites on the planet can no longer absorb, even if we're restricting numbers, but there's just so many people? What happens when these sites can no longer absorb all these crowds?
Well, yeah, I think we have to look towards that. I mean, we have 1.2 billion people traveling annually, and that is just people that travel across borders. We expect travel and tourism to grow by 4% a year on average for the next 20 years. We've seen so many more people in the middle class in the South Asia and Asia regions who are traveling much more than ever before. So I am surprised, frankly, that there hasn't been more of a global summit on the question of how are we going to protect these places. In my book, I've made some suggestions. These are very high-ranking suggestions about how we need to combine the revenues, as I just mentioned, from tourism taxes with what I would call very savvy policies to manage crowds and volume, some of the things you and I just discussed. We may have to go to more digital technology. I think that's going to happen, where we're going to see that you can't even go to an area until you're notified that there aren't so many people in the area, this kind of thing. Just like when you go to a restaurant and they have those buzzers to let you know it's time to go to your table. Those are really simple technologies, actually, right? So if you're going to the Taj Mahal, let's just say your group doesn't even go over to the ticket booth until they're notified it's time. What's the problem with that? So these are some of the things that I believe that can be implemented with these permit systems, and also so that people aren't standing around in long lines waiting. I mean, what's the point? Right?
Yeah, I mean, if you could set up an appointment or a reservation and then know that you'd be probably let in around that time, so you don't have to wait in long lines, and then get a buzzer, and sometime during that hour
Mhm.
You'll have your turn. I like that idea.
And not only that, say, maybe there's a whole series of nice restaurants or other areas that are within easy access of just the way they do with museums, where you go to a nice museum restaurant while you're waiting for your turn to go into a museum. Well, these places are the same. I've been to museums in Boston that do that. They say, well, right now you can't go in, but we can organize it so that you can go in at 3 o'clock, but we have this terrific restaurant right here. Well, obviously that's good for everybody. It's good for the local vendors and restaurateurs, and it helps to create more opportunity for people rather than having everyone miserable and standing in line waiting to go into a place that's overcrowded. So I am really surprised, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity in future to talk about all the progress that's been made on this.
Wonderful. Do you think that opportunity is coming? Like you mentioned, maybe a global summit to talk about solutions.
Well, I haven't been hearing about it, but I think that there is a matter of time that where we really will start to see this discussion. I know that in the blog that I think you're posting associated with my discussion with you, I mentioned that some of the largest travel and tourism corporate leaders are starting to say we need some studies on this. So that's the first stage of a discussion. So they're going to get some studies done. And in the meantime, there are meetings at the global level on the idea of what's called smart destinations. Now, my colleagues have already attended the first discussion, and that was mostly about marketing. So we were a little disappointed, but we're going to continue to track that because we believe, too, that with the management of crowds, that can make a big difference. And so we're hoping that slowly but surely there'll be a recognition that we're not going to become a less populated planet, first of all, nor are we going to have fewer and fewer people traveling. Quite the contrary, we expect, hopefully, more and more people in China alone are now becoming capable of leaving China for the first time to take trips. This is not going to go slower. It's probably going to accelerate. So rather than pretending this is not happening or just jumping for joy that everyone's going to make so much money, I think that we need to have something in the middle there and talk about how we can make this positive experience while at the same time, as I was just saying, manage it in a way where even more people benefit, right?
Exactly. And future generations can enjoy the same places that we see in the same or even better, hopefully, condition.
Right. And that whole idea of sharing, it gets back to what we decided we would talk about, which is sharing. And I think it's so important that all of us as travelers realize that we are actually sharing the planet now, and that we do have to leave behind this idea of, I want to be the first one there. A lot of people I know really have trouble with that. They really do want to be the first one in all these places, and I understand that, but they have to realize that our planet and all these beautiful resources are now resources that we are going to have to share, and that we're sharing it for really good reasons because all of these people are now joining us on these terrific journeys from countries that used to be poor. And that's really, really good news, right? So if we care about poverty, for example, if we care about all of these beautiful aspirations that more and more people can share the beautiful resources on our planet, well, then we all have to work together to make sure that these places are protected.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Okay, so we mentioned a few times during this conversation about ways that we can share and ways that we can, help maintain these beautiful places. I'm wondering if you have more ideas on how we can continue sharing and continue that work.
Yeah, so I was saying I think that there's a lot of solutions that we're cooking up in my work at both Harvard and Cornell where we're really researching that. And some of the solutions that we're coming up with have to do with how we manage our carbon emissions. That's a big topic. Travel and tourism is about 5% of the carbon emissions on the planet. And if it goes unmanaged, it could get up to 30% in the next 15, 20 years because that many more people are going to be taking airplanes all over the world. So the airlines have actually agreed through an international agreement to, as of 2020, start offsetting, which means putting funds towards projects that would actually help offset the carbon emissions from travel. And that offers a lot of exciting opportunities for us academics. But even for travelers, if you think about it, I know there's many, many people that think that offsetting is legitimate, and all I can tell you is there is no other solution. So be very supportive of this. You will maybe see a very slight change, and it'll be a kind of like almost like a new tax, but it would be very small, and the sum total of that would end up being hundreds of millions of dollars to go towards potentially protecting important destinations around the world. So that's one that we're tracking closely. Of course, that won't happen until 2020. And then the other big one for us is to come to a better understanding of how to value these natural resources within the businesses themselves. So we're really asking business to start to do some more accounting on this. We do see some accounting from business, but we're going to need more. Because we're going to need to ultimately understand it's not just you and it's not just the government that I just mentioned, but it's also business and how they can account for conserving these places. Because you are dependent on those coral reefs. If you want to go to a beautiful white beach in the Caribbean, you won't have those white beaches if we don't have coral reef. It is the coral reef of the Caribbean that makes the white sand beaches. And they are deteriorating rapidly. In my book, I discuss it, Claire. They've seen tremendous loss of those reefs. Now, this is not 100% because of tourism by any means, but it is tourism related. And so we're seeing, some of these very important tourism related resources start to deteriorate. So we have to start to account for that within our business strategies too. So we're looking at that. And then ultimately, we're very interested in how we can keep like records almost. There's a lot of global accounting that might be possible so that we can begin to kind of keep tabs on these resources and how much tourism is affecting them. And if we don't do that, if we don't measure, then how are we going to be able to actually help people to understand how to invest in preserving? So those are just some examples of what we're working on at Harvard and Cornell.
Yeah, well, that's exciting. That's very exciting. And I guess kind of thinking to that degree, for, viewers who are interested in traveling to these places and might be wondering, well, maybe I shouldn't be going at all. Maybe I should, be figuring out how best I can, share these resources and whatnot. I mean, just an idea is, when you go to an eco lodge or you've done some research and you find a hotel that is community-based, that is working on, programs to protect the environment, let them know. Let them know that, I came here because of this is what you said you do, and I really support that. And, or if you see something happening that looks a little suspicious or looks like maybe they could be doing a better job protecting, their environments, say so. And you can always vote with your dollars, and let them know, I'm not going to stay at this place because you said you do this, or you said that conservation is not your priority, things like that. And so I feel as if travelers voice their choices and why they're choosing, then the tourism industry will listen.
Well, I have a great anecdote on that. I was just actually here in the United States at Ithaca, New York, because I was going to meetings at Cornell, and I stayed in a Marriott, and they changed their room service policy, so they no longer use the plates and washable, reusable items to serve your food. They handed it all to me in a plastic bag with all plastic utensils and cellophane and double plasticized containers for my food. I was shocked. And I asked the young people at the desk, and they said, well, that was a brand management decision. In other words, they are locally owned, the hotel, but this came with the Marriott chain. So, of course, Marriott is often trying to do the right thing. So I asked them, well, who would be in charge? And they didn't know. But then I got on the minibus, and the people started talking, and I realized that they were actually the management company in charge of that hotel. And so I said, is anyone here in charge of room service? And they said, yes, I am. And so I gave him my input, and he said, we don't like that policy either, and we have to pay more for giving the plastic to everyone than the original policy of using reusable plates. So that was a lucky circumstance where I actually met the guy in charge. That almost never happens. But he was happy to take my input, and he wanted to report it back to the brand management. So I think, yes, be aware of when these policies just don't make sense. But also be aware that the people at the desk are unlikely to be able to do anything about it because they don't work for the brand, because hotels are franchised. Mm-hmm. So the best thing to do is to write the brand management, the actual main company, the corporate headquarters.
Okay, great, good advice. And there usually are channels available either online or through the hotel, where you can write a comment card and make sure that it gets to the right people.
Yeah.
So excellent. Great. Well, thank you so much for being here today. Is there anything else that you would like to share with viewers?
Well, I think that we've had a great conversation. I think we've covered really how the world is changing now. If there's anything that I think travelers can do now, it's to rethink how they perceive the world and what's available to them and how we're going to have to share it in future. The only other thing I would say is that if you want to be a responsible traveler, you have to realize that airline travel is a big part of your impact. It's well over 50% of your impact is every single time you step on a plane. So the last piece of advice I would give is to remember our atmosphere and to look to lower your carbon emissions. And the best way to do that is to actually probably travel less frequently but take longer trips.
Okay, wonderful. And that kind of gets into slow travel and immersing yourself and having a more memorable experience or an authentic experience as well. And we're going to get into that on Sunday and learn exactly how to do that and some really good methods for immersing yourself. And the first thing is to spend more than a couple days.
Exactly.
Excellent.
So it's a perfect complement to the slow travel idea. And that's why I also think it's a great way to be more responsible.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time today, Megan, and your advice is greatly appreciated, and it's really interesting to see what's happening on the bigger scale, things that we don't see on a regular basis, and what's happening behind the scenes in the bigger industry. And while we'll be talking during the summit about some smaller things that travelers can do to make an impact, I mean, we all have to work together on this, and everybody has to hold each other accountable. And it's really great to have that insight. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad to offer it, and thanks for having me.